He hadn't called in almost a year, and honestly that alone should have told me everything I needed to know. But when the phone rang that Thursday afternoon and Jason's name lit up the screen, my heart skipped in a way I hadn't felt in ages. It was that little jolt, the kind that lifts your chest before you even manage to say hello. He told me they were having a small birthday get-together for Madison, my granddaughter, and said it might be nice if I came. Like it was just a casual thing. Like we hadn't been dancing around silence for the past few years. He even chuckled and said I ought to bring those sugar cookies I used to make. The ones with the cracked edges and cinnamon glaze on top. Outside it was raining, the soft kind of rain that makes the world feel quieter, gentler. I remember because I stood at the window for a full minute after the call ended, just holding the phone and breathing. I told myself this could be a new beginning, that maybe time really did wear the sharp edges down. Maybe being a mother wasn't always about losing. That night I packed slowly. I took out my navy blue dress, the one I saved for special things, and pressed it myself. I folded a hand-knitted scarf for Madison and tucked it neatly beside it. And then I slid an old photo into my purse. Just me and Jason back when he still wore braces and didn't mind holding my hand in public. I didn't plan to give it to him. I just needed it close. There's something about getting ready for a trip when you're older. You move slower. You notice how the house feels when you're about to leave it. You close the fridge door more gently. You water the plants a little more carefully. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was worried, because I was hopeful. And hope is heavier when you haven't carried it in a while. It had been so long since I looked forward to something that wasn't a new soup recipe or a senior discount at the pharmacy. Friday morning came. I stood at the door with my coat on, suitcase upright beside me, checking the time over and over. 8:13. Jason had said he'd be there around 8. It's funny how 5 minutes can feel like 50 when it's someone you love. He finally pulled up a little before 8:30. Music too loud for that early, windows down like it was summer. He grinned like everything was just fine. Like this had always been normal. And I smiled too, because that's what mothers do. Even when they don't know what's coming, they smile. And they go. If you've ever packed more hope than clothes into a suitcase, you'll understand. Jason stopped by the side entrance of the train station. The sky was already bright, but there was still a hush in the air, like the morning hadn't fully woken up yet. No traffic, just the occasional bird and a passing car. He leaned over to pop the trunk but didn't get out. Just stayed in the driver's seat, fingers drumming on the steering wheel like he had somewhere more important to be. I stepped out, knees aching a bit from the sudden movement, and pulled my suitcase onto the curb. He rolled the window down and said he'd already picked up my ticket. Told me to head inside and wait, the train would be there soon. He mentioned needing to grab coffee, said the new caterer was a mess. Then he smiled, not wide, not warm. Just a quick flicker, like a light switch flipped on for a second, then off again. And before I could even reply, he shifted into gear and drove off. No hug. No wave. Just the tail lights fading down the road. I pulled my suitcase close and stepped into the old train station. It hadn't been updated in decades. Faded vinyl seats bolted to the floor, 2 humming vending machines in the corner, and a wall clock ticking louder than it should have. I walked up to the counter and gave the woman my name. She typed, frowned, then asked if I was sure the ticket was bought today. I nodded. She tried again, then told me there was nothing under that name. I searched my purse. No ticket, no email. My phone was at 3%. I didn't have a charger. I sat down by the window, suitcase upright beside me, and waited. 5 minutes. Then 10. Then 30. No call. No message. No Jason. I kept telling myself he was just caught up in something. That it was a mistake. That maybe the ticket would show up or there was a glitch at the counter. Another hour passed. I went outside and looked up and down the street, hoping maybe I'd see his SUV pulling back in. But the curb was empty. Just an old man buying a newspaper and a scruffy dog trotting through the lot. I went back inside. The bench felt harder this time. The silence heavier. I sat, pulled my coat tight, and stared at that same clock. Second hand moved slow and steady, like it had all the time in the world. Unlike the one person who was supposed to show up. I didn't know it then, but I wasn't a traveler anymore. I was the one who got left behind. I sat as long as I could. Then I stood and paced the terminal back and forth. The woman behind the counter gave me a glance but didn't say a word. No one did. I was just another old woman waiting for something nobody else was expecting. I tried Jason's number again. This time it rang once, then went straight to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. My voice felt tight, stuck somewhere in my throat, and I didn't trust it to come out steady. I stepped outside. The sky had turned sharper, clouds gathering thick near the horizon like trouble moving in slow. I scanned the parking lot again, even checked around the back of the station, like maybe Jason would pop out suddenly like some bad magic trick. But there was no trace of him. Not even a shadow of that silver SUV. I walked over to the curb, hoping I'd spot a taxi or maybe catch a rideshare. My phone was black now. Battery gone, no charger, no backup. Just me, the wind, and that low hum of cars in the distance. I flagged down a woman walking by, someone who looked kind enough, and asked if I could borrow her phone. Just for one quick call. She hesitated for a second but then handed it to me. I dialed Jason again. One ring, then straight to a fast click. He declined it. I gave the phone back, thanked her. She didn't ask questions, just nodded and kept walking. Back inside, the bench felt harder than before. I dug through my purse again, checking every pocket twice. All I found was a folded $10 bill next to some crumpled tissues. That was it. I hadn't thought I'd need cash. I wasn't supposed to be traveling alone. I looked around. A young man with headphones sat hunched over his phone. A woman nearby had two sleeping kids across her lap. Nobody looked at me. And somehow that hurt more than if they had. At least if someone had seen me, I'd exist in their eyes. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, coat wrapped tight. The second hand on the wall clock kept ticking. Calm, slow, steady. Like it didn't care one bit. Then a soft voice cut through. You look like you could use something warm. I looked up. A woman about my age stood there holding a to-go cup. She wore a denim jacket with the collar fraying a little, and her eyes were kind. She said her name was Nora. Told me she ran a bookshop across the street. Said it wasn't anything fancy, mostly old paperbacks and bad coffee, but it was warm. And I could sit there for a while if I wanted. No pressure. Just a place to breathe. I nodded. I didn't have the energy to say no. We crossed the street together slowly. My suitcase wheels kept snagging on sidewalk cracks. Nora noticed, slowed down to match my pace without saying a word. She didn't talk much after that. Just opened the shop door, led me inside, and pointed to an old armchair near the front window. She didn't ask what had happened. She just let me sit. And for the first time that day, I stopped pretending I was fine. The shop smelled like old paper and something faintly toasted. Not sweet. More like dust and overbrewed tea. It was quiet, but the kind of quiet that wraps around you, not the kind that cuts. Nora moved behind the counter, still silent. She turned on a small kettle and pulled two chipped mugs off a shelf. Her hands moved slowly, aged sure but steady. No shake. Just life. I sank into that chair. It was deep, low, the kind that makes your spine finally let go. My coat was still on, my purse still in my lap. I didn't move much. Wasn't ready to. Nora brought me tea. No questions, no small talk. Just quiet kindness. The kind you only get from someone who's lived through something. We sat that way for a long while. I watched cars roll by outside. A group of teenagers passed, laughing too loud, their joy so far from where I sat it felt like it belonged in another world. I sipped the tea. It was bitter. But the kind of bitter that grows on you if you let it. Eventually Nora started to talk. Said she'd owned the shop for almost 30 years. Said people didn't read like they used to, but she kept it open anyway. Something about the way books carry weight. How they anchor you when nothing else can. I nodded. I understood. You can measure a whole life by the books you choose to keep. She never asked my name. Never asked why I was there. Just talked around the silence like it was an old companion. She told me she'd once been left at a bus station in Knoxville. Said it wasn't just being forgotten. It was worse. It was being made invisible. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking either, just clenched tight around that ceramic mug. I hadn't cried, not even back at the station. But in that old chair, listening to the soft creak of floorboards as Nora walked, something in me folded a little. She returned with a book. Said I didn't have to read it, just hold it if I wanted. Said sometimes the weight of a story helps more than the story itself. The cover was worn. The title almost gone. But the spine? It was strong. I let it rest in my lap, unopened. Just there. Thought. Something that hadn't left me. And I stayed like that for a long time. Later, as the afternoon sky turned to gray, Nora handed me a blanket. Told me I could stay as long as I needed. No rush. No closing bell. Just stay. So I did. That night I slept in a bookshop. My coat still on. A book unopened on my lap. A cup of tea still half full and cold beside me. And somehow I felt safer there than I had in a very long time. The next morning I woke to the sound of pages turning. Nora was already up front, reading something thick and old, her glasses sliding low on her nose. The shop felt warmer than it had the night before. Or maybe, deep down, I already had. Nora made a small pot of oatmeal on a hot plate behind the counter. No sugar, no milk, just plain oats with a few raisins tossed in. I ate it slowly, every bite warming something in my chest I didn't even know had gone cold. When I finished, she handed me a clean dish towel and nodded toward the sink. That was her way of saying thank you. No words. Just small acts that meant everything. By noon, I told her I needed to get home. She didn't ask where that was. She just handed me a paper bag with 2 granola bars, a bottle of water, and a folded umbrella. Said she had a feeling the sky wasn't finished yet. And she was right. Halfway through the bus ride, the clouds gave way. Rain tapped against the windows like it knew something I didn't. I sat near the back, my suitcase resting between my feet, water slowly pooling beneath the wheels. When I finally stepped back into my apartment, everything felt heavier. I peeled off my soaked coat, set the suitcase by the door, and walked straight to the filing cabinet in the closet. The drawer stuck from the humidity, but I yanked it open hard. Right in the middle folder were the documents Jason probably prayed I'd forgotten about. The trust account. The one my late husband had set up long before his first surgery. It was meant for Jason and Madison eventually, but I was still the primary trustee. I pulled out the folder and sat at the dining table, flipping through the pages one by one. The terms were crystal clear. Nothing could be withdrawn without my written permission. And there was a clause, one my husband insisted on after watching what his own mother went through. Any suggestion that I was mentally unfit had to be backed by official, independent medical verification. I'd known what Jason was doing for a while now. I could hear it in his voice, the way he spoke to me slowly like I was fragile. How he double-checked things I already said, how he offered to manage my mail, handle my appointments, always in that gentle, syrupy tone that carried quiet insult just under the surface. Behind the last page, tucked in the folder, was an envelope. Inside was a letter from the bank, a formal notice. Jason had tried to request a partial withdrawal. He'd even submitted a signed letter in my name to authorize it. But it wasn't my signature. I stared at it for a long time. The loops were off, the angle was too sharp. He must have copied it from one of the birthday cards I used to send Madison. He thought I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't check. I folded the papers back into a clean envelope and set it aside. He thought I was slipping, but I remembered everything. Especially this. The next morning I picked up the old landline in my kitchen and dialed Richard. He answered on the second ring. His voice was just like I remembered. Low, steady, the kind of voice that had spent a lifetime reading contracts and catching lies. I told him I needed to come by. He didn't ask why. Just gave me a time. I caught the next bus into the city. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet. The sidewalks gleamed like someone had brushed them with varnish. Richard's office was in a quiet brick building, tucked between a post office and a legal library. I hadn't stepped foot there since my husband's funeral. Richard opened the door before I even knocked. He gave me a simple nod and gestured toward the same brown leather chair I used to sit in when we signed the first version of the trust. It squeaked when I leaned back. Some things don't change. I slid the forged letter across the desk. He didn't touch it right away. Just looked at it, then looked at me. You remember what we wrote into the original documents? I nodded. Every word. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a red folder, marked with my husband's initials. Inside was a sealed envelope I had never seen before. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and laid it out in front of me. It was an addendum, signed 6 months before my husband passed. A clause that had never needed to be triggered. It said that if any beneficiary ever tried to manipulate, forge, or pressure the trustee in any way, the trust would be frozen immediately. Access revoked, permanently. Unless both of 2 named legal advisors, now deceased, voted to reinstate it. Which meant it couldn't be undone. Richard placed the page in front of me and tapped it with his finger. This gives us grounds to act. All we need is written notice and evidence. The letter you brought? That's more than enough. He handed me a pen. I signed. He picked up the phone and called the financial institution. His tone didn't waver. Calm, flat, precise. He cited the clause, named the section, confirmed I was still the active trustee with full legal authority. When he hung up, it was done. The account was frozen. Jason would be notified only after a formal review. I leaned back in the chair and looked up at the painting on the wall. A quiet forest, golden leaves, a path disappearing into blur. My husband had picked it. Said it reminded him of the woods behind his childhood home. I never liked it. Always thought it felt too still, too unsure. But that day I understood it a little better. Richard slid the folder back into the drawer and turned the key. He didn't say much after that. Just walked me to the door, rested a hand on my shoulder and waited, like he knew I needed a second to breathe. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked out. And for the first time in weeks, my steps felt like they belonged to me again. I got home that afternoon and didn't even bother taking off my shoes. Went straight to the kitchen table, pulled out the envelope Richard had given me, and laid it flat beside my notepad. The bank had frozen the trust, sure, but that wasn't enough. Not for me. I clicked on the old desk lamp and started writing. Not to Jason. That part of me had already gone quiet. I wrote to the office of the Inspector General. I listed everything, every detail. The forged signature, the false claims, the attempt to gain legal consent. I included names, dates, institutions. No drama, no bitterness. Just facts. Quiet and full. I attached a copy of the forged document and Richard's written statement. Signed everything in blue ink. Then I sealed it up, slid it into my purse and headed to the post office. Just 4 blocks away. The air was sharp and still, the kind that wakes you up better than any cup of coffee ever could. I mailed the letter with a return receipt, watched the clerk stamp it, then drop it in a big canvas bin like it wasn't holding the weight of an entire family unraveling. I didn't flinch. Just turned and walked out. Back home, I opened the kitchen drawer and found my old checkbook. I hadn't used it in months. I sat down at the table and started writing small checks. One to the retirement fund I had let lapse. One to the heating company to prepay the winter bill. One to the local literacy program I used to volunteer for. Before Jason told me I was too tired to keep doing things like that. Each check felt like a quiet reclaiming. Not revenge. Just restoration. 2 days later, Richard called. Jason had finally reached out. Wanted answers. Richard told him the truth. The trust was frozen. The documents were under legal review. There would be no access, no payout, no more quiet theft. Jason didn't call me. Didn't leave a voicemail. But I knew he got the message. Sometimes silence says more than any apology could. Later that week, I went to the bank myself. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to look the teller in the eye when I asked her to confirm who had control. She pulled up the screen, glanced at me and nodded. I was still the only authorized person. Still the one who got to decide what happened next. I left with a printed slip tucked in my coat pocket. Just a piece of paper, but I kept my hand on it the whole way home. Like if I let go, it might float away. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea. No lights on except the glow from the stovetop. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, my chest didn't feel tight anymore. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't slammed any doors. But Jason no longer had access to what he thought was already his. And I had taken back what was always mine. Then late Wednesday morning, the intercom buzzed. I was folding towels on the couch and the sound startled me more than it should have. I wiped my hands and pressed the button. It was a delivery guy, with a large envelope, courier service, no return address. Just my name typed neat and clean on the front. I signed for it, didn't ask questions, brought it inside. I already knew what it was. Inside was a copy of a letter Jason had sent to the legal review board. Full of defense. Pages of it. Miscommunication. Misunderstanding. Misplaced responsibility. He claimed I'd forgotten conversations. Claimed I was mixing up timelines. Said I'd been slipping for some time. No apology. Just careful justifications. He never once used the word forgery. Never mentioned the letter he faked. Instead, he painted himself as a worried son trying to do the right thing. There was also an affidavit from a family doctor I hadn't seen in 3 years. The date had been altered. The note was vague, just something about stress, aging, and forgetfulness. Nothing official. Nothing concrete. Just soft words that could bend whichever way someone wanted them to. I set the papers down. My hands didn't tremble. I already knew what it felt like to be quietly erased. But what stayed with me, what stuck, wasn't the letter. It was what came later that day. I had stepped out for groceries. Just a few things: milk, bread, some apples. When I got back, the voicemail light on my phone was blinking. 2 messages. The first was from the clinic, confirming my upcoming physical. The second was from Madison. Her voice was soft, quieter than I remembered. She said she'd heard things. She wasn't sure what was going on, but she just wanted to say hi. That was all. Just hi. No callback number. No mention of where she was staying. Just said she missed the cookies I used to bake. Then she hung up. It didn't sound like a message she was supposed to leave. Sounded like one whispered when no one else was around. I sat on the edge of the kitchen chair, one hand still holding the grocery bag, and let her voice play twice. Then I deleted it. Not out of anger. Out of something deeper. A quiet knowing. She hadn't called for me. She wasn't calling for me, not really. She was reaching out to a version of me that had been made distant. One she wasn't sure she still knew. She didn't have all the facts. Not yet. But she was starting to notice the cracks. I went back to unpacking the groceries. Apples in the bowl on the counter, bread in the drawer, milk in the fridge. The world hadn't stopped. But it had shifted just slightly. The kind of shift you only feel when the silence starts stretching in the wrong direction. And in that stillness, something settled in me. He wasn't in control anymore. But he didn't know it yet. It was Richard who suggested we meet again, in person this time. He said there was something I needed to hear, something he didn't want to say over the phone. We met at a little diner off Maple Street. The kind with worn-out leather booths and waitresses who never wrote anything down. I got there early and chose a seat facing the door. Richard came in 10 minutes later, looking more tired than usual, a manila folder under his arm. He slid into the seat across from me, ordered black coffee, and skipped right over the small talk. He placed the folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed emails. Dozens of them. Most from Jason. A few from someone at the bank. One from a lawyer I didn't recognize. But they all circled the same thing. Access, leverage, strategy. Richard tapped one in particular. It was dated 2 weeks before I got that phone call about Madison's birthday. In it, Jason laid out a plan to temporarily isolate me. No direct words, just corporate phrases: compliance, streamlining, managing the transition. He hadn't just been hoping I'd fade quietly, he'd been building it. The invitation, the train station, the timing, none of it had been random. Richard leaned back while I read. He didn't say a word. Didn't soften anything. I closed the folder and let my hands rest on it. They felt heavy, not from surprise but from understanding. I asked what would happen next. He told me the bank's internal review was complete. The signatures didn't match. The access attempt had been logged. There would be no legal action, unless I filed a formal complaint. I didn't speak. Just nodded. Then he added something else. A second financial institution had reached out. Jason had tried to move assets using credentials from his own firm. That attempt had been flagged, too. I let it all settle. None of it felt like a betrayal anymore. Felt like confirmation. I had known. I just hadn't seen all the edges. We sat in silence while the waitress refilled our mugs. Eventually, Richard stood, handed me the folder, and said to take my time. No deadline. Just the truth, waiting for when I was ready to use it. I walked home with that folder tucked under my coat, pressed close to my chest. The air had turned colder, but I didn't mind. At home, I set it down on the kitchen counter. I didn't open it again, not yet. I just stood there, coat still on, eyes on the window as the light began to fade. He had made every move with the confidence of someone sure no one was watching. But I had seen enough. No. I held the one piece he forgot I still had. The knock came just after 6. Not loud, just 3 short taps, like someone testing the weight of being there. I stayed seated on the couch, lights off except the one above the sink. I looked through the peephole. It was Jason. Suit jacket a little wrinkled. Phone in hand. Shoulders squared like he was about to give a sales pitch. I watched him for a moment. Let the stillness between us stretch. He knocked again, softer this time. Then waited. I didn't move. Eventually I heard him exhale. Shifted his stance. Reached into his coat, pulled out an envelope and slid it under the door. Then nothing. No goodbye. No retreating footsteps. Just silence. I waited a full 10 minutes before picking it up. Inside was a handwritten letter. Neat, spaced carefully. The kind of letter people write when they think they're out of options. He said he'd made mistakes. That he'd overstepped. That he thought he was protecting me, from confusion, from financial stress, from the burden of too much control. But he never said what he'd actually done. Just danced around it using careful, distant words. He asked to meet. Said we should talk. Said we needed to clear the air. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope and slid it into the drawer beside my keys. I didn't plan to answer. The next morning I walked to the notary's office. Richard had already prepared the updated documents. Full revocation of Jason's access. Reassignment of the secondary beneficiary. Madison's name removed for now. Richard told me it could be reversed later if I chose. I signed every page with steady hands, my initials right in the margins. The notary stamped the last page and handed me the final copy. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like closure. On the way home I passed the bench where I used to sit with Madison when she was little. We'd feed the ducks and count yellow leaves in the fall. I didn't stop. I just walked past it, eyes forward. When I got home the apartment felt lighter. It didn't feel different exactly. It was cleaner. The kind of clean that only silence can bring. That evening I made a small pot of soup. Nothing fancy, just lentils, carrots and a bit of rosemary from the windowsill. I ate alone at the kitchen table. No distractions. I didn't check the mailbox. Didn't look at my phone. Some things no longer needed checking. That night I slept straight through until morning. No dreams. No restlessness. Just the quiet breath of a home that no longer held doubt. Jason had finally come to see me, but I didn't need to be seen anymore. He had already shown me everything I needed to understand. By leaving me behind he gave me the room to find myself again. The morning was gray but not heavy. Just still in the kind of way that makes decisions feel easier. I got dressed with care. Pressed slacks, a blouse I hadn't worn in months, and the necklace with the single pearl my husband gave me on our 30th anniversary. It rested gently at my collarbone, like a memory, soft and free of bitterness. I took the bus to the bank. The same one Jason had used. The same place where he had smiled at managers, slid paperwork across polished counters, and pretended none of it was cruel. I walked in, asked for the senior associate, gave my name and waited. She came out within minutes, warm smile, hand outstretched, and led me to a small office with frosted glass and 2 leather chairs. She'd already reviewed the documents Richard had sent. Everything was in order. No questions. Just confirmations. I handed over the signed forms, the full revocation of joint access, the consolidation of assets into my name, the removal of all other signatories. When she asked if I wanted notifications sent, I shook my head. No alerts. No warnings. Just finality. She stamped the last page, handed me a folder with my new statements and thanked me for coming in person. As I passed the teller window, a young man behind the glass gave me a polite smile. I smiled back. He reminded me of a boy Jason once coached in Little League. Same posture, same open face. But this one hadn't learned to pretend yet. Outside the wind had picked up. I pulled my coat a little tighter, held the folder against my chest. At the corner I stopped at the bakery and bought a single apple tart. Still warm. The woman behind the counter wrapped it gently, added a napkin without being asked. I thanked her and took the long way home. I ate it at the kitchen table while watching the leaves flicker outside. The taste was clean. Not too sweet. The crust flaked softly without resistance. I didn't rush. Later that afternoon I opened a new account at a different bank. One Jason didn't know. One Madison had never stepped inside. It wasn't to hide. It was just to begin, right from where I was. That evening I poured a glass of cold water, stood at the kitchen sink and looked down at the street below. Cars passed. Lights changed. Life kept moving with or without permission. Jason had played all his cards. But the final decision had never been his. And now there was nothing left to take. Only what I chose to keep. A week passed. No calls. No letters. No knocks at the door. Just stillness, the kind that doesn't echo. It simply settles. I visited the bookshop again. Nora greeted me with a simple nod. No questions. No mention of the day I'd first walked in with nothing but a suitcase and a shaken voice. She handed me a cup of that same bitter tea. This time I didn't mind the taste. I had grown into it. I sat in the same old chair by the window, but this time I brought a book. One I had once loved, then forgotten in the noise of everything else. I read slowly, page by page, like I was returning to a version of myself that had simply waited, quietly. Later I stopped by the market. Bought fresh basil, ripe tomatoes, a wedge of cheese. I hadn't made a proper meal in a while. That night I did. Not for anyone else, just for me. The kitchen filled with a new kind of warmth. One that didn't need a name. Before bed I opened the windows. Let the cold air in. It felt like it was clearing the last of him from the walls. The space didn't feel empty. It felt restored. I took the letter he'd written, the one he slid under my door, folded it gently and placed it in the back of the filing cabinet. Not because I needed to reread it. Not out of sentiment. Just as a reminder. Not everything needs to be burned. Some things just need to be put away. The next morning I walked through the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the light soft. I passed the train station, the one he left me at, but this time I didn't stop. I kept walking. And I didn't look back.